All right, so welcome everybody. It's lovely actually to have this size and to actually be able to see you. So you will have seen that we're recording. So by continuing on, you agree to that. You should have been prompted to agree or not. It's great to have your videos on if you feel comfortable, just so that our speakers have people they can check in with and see and pretend that they're together in a room. But if you could all mute, that would be super helpful, just so that there's no conflicting background noise. As this year's faculty coordinator of the MacDonald Langstaff workshop series, I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this second workshop. The series started in 1988 at the Faculty of Law, named after MacDonald Langstaff, the first woman to earn a law degree in Quebec, and she obviously did so at McGill. She did so as a single mom, and when she graduated in 1914 with first-class honors, she was actually not permitted to write her exams for the Quebec bar. She worked as a legal assistant in the end over 6 decades, and during that career continued to fight for women's equality, particularly with respect to the right to practice as lawyers in this province. Eventually, in 1941, women were admitted to the bar. MacDonald Langstaff herself was admitted after her death in 2006 as a symbolic gesture to the bar, and given the Medal of Honor, which is housed at our Faculty of Law for when we get back to our building, people can see it. So this year's series, co-sponsored by the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism, to which I'm very grateful, is organized around one unifying theme: leading the change, the potential and power of women in law. And one of the wonderful things about organizing the series with the center is that our guests have been, the names of our potential guests have come to us from members of the center, colleagues, so teaching colleagues, but also doctoral colleagues, and that's the case today. And the series, the workshops this year are all organized in the form of dialogues between some of our international women doctoral students at McGill and our invited speakers. And today's is particular because of this match between Paula Martins, our doctoral candidate from Brazil, who indeed is responsible for bringing Julia Neiva, our guest today, to us and to our attention, and the two of them will indeed fill our workshop time with a dialogue, and then there will be time at the end for others to ask questions and to continue that conversation. So I'm just going to introduce Paula, actually our doctoral candidate, and then she will introduce our guest. So Paula, as I mentioned, is a doctoral candidate at McGill from Brazil, researching on freedom of information issues under the supervision of Professor Nandini Ramanujam, who is the current director of the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism. Paula is the regional editor for the Americas with the Freedom of Expression Exchange and a project lead at Media for Democracy. She acted as a regional director with Article 19, an NGO that some of you may be familiar with, for many years, after serving as a researcher for Human Rights Watch and as a human rights officer at the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So she obviously has much experience on the ground with human rights observing and advocacy and evolution. So Paula came to us to do a doctorate at McGill after doing a master's in law at NYU in New York University and a master's in public policy at Oxford. So she has done the tour du monde and is now with us at McGill and actually in Montreal. So now I'm going to turn over to Paula to introduce our guest.
Thank you so much, Professor Van Praagh. It's really an honor to be participating in this series of conversations, and it is my pleasure to introduce Julia Neiva, and also my privilege to start the conversation with her today and to monopolize it for a couple of minutes before opening up to you all. Well, Julia is an Afro-Brazilian human rights activist, a young woman with a long human rights career. She has a bachelor degree from the Pontifical University of São Paulo. She has an LLM from Columbia University, and she is now getting her PhD in human rights from the Law School of the University of São Paulo. And Julia is also today the coordinator of the Development and Social Environmental Rights Program at Conectas Human Rights. She's based in São Paulo. Conectas is one of the largest organizations working on human rights in the region, and it's also like a leading voice engaging in international spaces and policy spaces related to human rights at the global level. Coming from the South. It's a voice from the South in these international spaces. Julia worked before Conectas for many years as a representative and senior researcher at the Center for Information on Business and Human Rights. And as well as other organizations, of course. She also collaborated with academia, with the Columbia Law School Human Rights Clinic, the Center for Reproductive Rights. She worked a lot in Brazil, but also for a number of years in Latin America, and she has extensive work as well in Africa. So it's really a pleasure. Welcome, Julia, to have you with us today. And I'll start with where you started. So I know that you started your career when you were still in law school, and then many years later you came back to law school to organize the first business and human rights academic course in Brazil. And now we are here at the law school in McGill talking about human rights. I was wondering if you could discuss with us and tell us a little bit of the role of human rights in legal education. What is the context now in Brazil? What's the space that human rights has within legal education, especially in a country with so many systematic violations going on every year? What are the challenges? So Julia, let's start there.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. An honor, really. It's an honor, Paula, Professor Shauna, Praagh. It's really, really an honor. I was very, very glad to get this invitation, and it's this opportunity to really engage in a dialogue. So when you offered me the option to choose whether you wanted to do something more formal or informal, I always find, if there is the possibility of doing an engaging dialogue, more exciting. So Paula, it's a pleasure to be here. And I think the first question Paula asks me, so I think I can divide this in two answers. So the first thing really is, it's an honor to be speaking about human rights at the law school today. And that's something that when Paula and I were in law school some years ago, it was not mandatory. Human rights was somehow in the program, was increasing to be in the legal programs, but it was not widespread. And at the time, and I would say now also, it was considered something like a detail, complementary, but never something fundamental, not something that should be mandatory. And it is for sure different from the scenario we faced when we were in law school. So 15 to 20 years ago, it was very different from what it is now, because now it is in the programs of law school and in I would say in most of the country. But the perception that human rights is not something we should really be taking into consideration. Is it still the same, or maybe even worse with the government we currently have? So so one of the things I think it is important to highlight is that there are programs now. So the program I am in for my PhD is a human rights program. So that's an advance, and within the law school, it does not have like professors only in part of this program, but it is already a progress. It is professors who work in other areas, who are specialists in other themes. They come to teach at the human rights program and the law school. And another thing that I find it very interesting is that they usually, when we enter the program, we are advised to actually do courses, because in Brazil, when you do a PhD, you actually have to attend classes. So you don't only do your research, but you have to attend classes. So we are, they tell us, why don't you go to other classes of human rights, or other classes in sociology or psychology or education or history, or whatever you want, so to broaden also the concept. This is like a big, I think, improvement. Now, the second part of my answer is, I think one of the reasons why human rights is not part of, of mandatory in law school, and not in many other courses either, is the general perception that human rights are only the protection of prisoners' rights. This is an old perception. And although I agree that human rights include prisoners' rights, as an advocate of human rights, like I consider myself a human rights defender, we've been pushing for the really understanding that human rights is about all human rights. And it does include prisoners' rights, but it does include many other rights. So I've been working for the last 15 years on two main focuses, which are social and environmental rights, and also fighting racial and gender discrimination, and the intersection of those areas. And I don't think this, and the main reason I think most people in Brazil do believe that human rights are dead. It's changing, but I think it's changing slowly, and with such a conservative and violent government that has very discriminatory narratives, it increases the number of people who think human rights are only prisoners' rights. I think the main reason for that is our history. We have a history of violence, of slavery, so of oppression. So the structures of our society are based on structural racism, right? With colonization, and we can see that until the date. And also based on a model, an economic model that is very predatory. So which is mining, which is repressive violence. I state that it is violent per se, like the response of the state to the main problems of our society is always with violence. So it is part of who we are. So it is not surprising that we see human rights in this framework as a society. So these are, I think some of the issues I can continue talking about, the history of what our perceptions, and I can also address other issues. I know with Paula and I, we've talked about many other issues. I can come back to that again too, if you have other questions.
Great. So I think I'll jump now to the future and
Okay.
get where we are right now and what you're doing right now, because you already
Sure.
mentioned something there. I was about to ask you about the program that you're coordinating right now, because the name of your program is Development and Social Environmental Rights. And I wanted to include extractivist industry into that equation. And maybe if you could tell us a bit more of how these different expressions or these different things merge together, and what's the dynamic that you have and the kind of work that you do today in Brazil.
Thank you, Paula. So yeah, so that fits. That's a really a continuation of the first issue that we talked about, because it is really understanding that the perception of human rights should be broadened than only prisoners' rights or civic and political rights. Although this is very important, and I should highlight that the moment we are in Brazil, there have been several challenges to democracy and attempts to really worsen and really make institutions weaken, to weaken institutions that are the basis of democracy. So I'm not saying civil political rights are not necessary. They're more than necessary in times like now. But along with that, we have to think about social and environmental rights as also fundamental for democracy. And I think that's what we try we've been trying to do in my program, is this perception that development has to be inclusive, and that if we only think of development as economy, as based on increasing the economy, increasing our role in the world as producers, as a big player, without thinking on the impact of people, and it's not going to work. I mean, it's not working. And then we've been doing the connection of development with social environmental rights, thinking about the impacts that our development has been based on. Most of the development thinking in Brazil has been thinking on the increasing and strengthening of the infrastructure system. So that means building roads, building dams, building everything that is needed for infrastructure, which is important, but the problem is how we do that. And then mining and the extractive sector is also very important in the basis of Brazilian economy. And it has been so since our colonization. So since for the last 300 years, Brazil has been having a role in depending on mining for that. So that's the first connection we can make with the extractive sector. So my program, we're discussing development and social environmental rights, and we have four main focus in our work. One is on financial development institutions. So we are looking at how development banks, such as the Brazilian Development Bank or the World Bank or the BRICS Bank, NDB, have played a role in financing infrastructure in Brazil, and how these institutions have not really totally considered human rights as criteria for this financement, right? So this is one of the focus of our work. And lately, and for the last years, even before I rejoined Conectas, the program was focusing on trying to influence from within and have these institutions have in their governance human rights as an environmental right, social environmental rights, as the main criteria, as one of as a fundamental criteria for financing. So, and now we also focus on the impacts of this institution finance. And then we have another focus, which is combating forced labor, which is within the extractive sector in Brazil. It is in the infrastructure sector, it is in the commodities production sector, it is in the food sector, it is widespread in Brazil, unfortunately. And our role has been producing coffee, orange, cattle, timber, right? So we are exporter of these products. And we've been, I'm not wrong, I don't think I would be wrong, it would be wrong to say that in most of the supply chains in which both Brazilian companies, but also international, transnational companies are involved, it involves forced labor. So it is really part of the production system in Brazil. And then we have another focus, which is on the impacts of the extractive sector. And then, as I mentioned before, I think, unfortunately, our system is based on the predatory mining and predatory agribusiness. Sorry, agribusiness is not really extractive, but it's very connected in many places. Timber production. So we've been looking at the impact of the extractive sector as a whole to communities. So to either traditional communities, indigenous groups, quilombola communities, or even rural communities or communities that live near or in the lands that are used for mining and the other extractive sector. And I think and we've been working on a few cases. So we've been working mostly on the case of the two dam breaks that happened in the last 5 years in Brazil. So one was the Rio Doce disaster that involved Vale, one of the biggest mining companies in the world, and BHP, the other biggest mining company in the world. That is a UK company, also Australian. And then there was another disaster last year, the Brumadinho Dam disaster, that it was also a Taily Dams disaster. So it is not, we don't think this were impossible to prevent. On the contrary, they are the response of a predatory model. So in my program, one of the focus has been to focus on cases like this. And the final program area is on climate justice. And we've been trying to work with the climate justice initiative with a very human rights perspective. So understanding that we cannot discuss climate justice without thinking about human rights. They are absolutely interconnected, and we should be thinking of people also when we discuss climate change. I mean, the environment, everything as a whole. So we've been the main avenue that we've been focusing on for climate discussions. It has been strategic litigation. So we actually, with a bunch of organizations, we just filed a big case 2 days ago on climate and human rights and deforestation in Brazil in the Amazon forest. And I'm very proud of that. And we have a very good team that is been working with many other organizations that you might know, and we've been very happy to do that. So Paula, so that's what we've been doing, and we work on doing strategic litigation. We do a lot of advocacy also in the Congress and international level. So we use the UN fora and the inter-American system as not only places where we can bring cases, but also political places for pressure. And we've been we've been trying to also increase our actions around OECD. So Brazil is trying to become a member of OECD. It is already a big partner, but not yet a member. And so we are using this as leverage for pressure, really, to increase and pressure the government for, for better policy, to really work on the opposite way that it has been going in the last few years. And then the last thing I wanted to say, which I think is also a continuation of this perception of human rights, is that when this government took power in 2018, it took power with a very strong narrative of against human rights, against indigenous people, against the protection of climate, the climate and the environmental, against people who live in the forests, against Black people, against Black youth, against women. It is, so we've been trying to resist and to this government, and he did what he promised. In the first day of his government, he started enacting decrees and federal decrees that would also pose these rights to threat, and also democracy at risk. So I think it's always important to look at this as thinking about the context in which Brazil is now. And then the final comment about the extractive sector that Paula asked me to also comment is that so there is a shocking but not surprising data that shows that in the government of Bolsonaro, there were the highest number of companies requesting to open mines in indigenous lands. So it is not surprising, because it's a government that has been saying that it is okay to do that in indigenous lands, that it is good for indigenous peoples, and this is really challenge our own constitution and our own international commitments. And it is really related to the way we perceive indigenous peoples in Brazil as a nation. So not really, unfortunately, they are not seen as having the right to decide about their own lives, although this is protected in our constitution. So this is really related to the way the mining is, and the extractive sector is, has a role in our society. So I think these are some of the highlights, but we can continue also.
Thanks, Julia.
Talking further, you're most welcome, Paulinha.
So in this description, it seems to me that your role today, or the type of work that you have been doing today, is much more directed to a little bit of naming and shaming, and a bit more conflictive in the sense that it's using strategic litigation against I don't know, the state, or directly against the companies. But it seems to me that in your previous, given the work that I know of the reference center, it's a different type of approach that was much more setting up a dialogue, engaging with the private sector, trying to bring the private sector to the table to discuss the impact of their developments, of their projects. So how do you feel about these different strategies, and how did you feel being there and doing these different types of advocacy at that time and now, ethical concerns, and yes, could you share a little bit? And what do you think it works? What do you think works better? Or
right, I love this question. Because I think we should always pose also ethical questions to what we do. Thank you, Paula. So in the beginning of this year, a dear friend who I worked with at the center, at the Business Human Rights Research Center for the last 7 years before rejoining Conectas. We wrote a paper, and we were very honest with our ethical, dilemmas, I would say. Being women and women from the South, and trying to do this dialogues between companies and companies that are headquartered in the North, that are operating in our countries where most of the human rights violations actually happen. Not saying that in the North it doesn't happen, but in these big supply chains, many of the human rights violations do happen in our region. So our work consisted in bringing human rights violations to a portal. We would post news about this. This was one of the things we did. So we brought this to this portal. There was in 7 languages, and we would invite companies to respond to that. And I think that's a good strategy, in the sense that it brings more information. So we gave the opportunity to companies to respond. And when companies responded to these allegations of human rights violations, we would go back to the victims, to the affected communities, so that it would comment back on what the companies had said. And this was sometimes, I think, very powerful, in the sense that it's very hard sometimes to make companies really listen to what communities are saying. However, we also thought that many times they would just use the same framework for their responses, sometimes even very long responses, in which they would deny their human rights involvement, would deny their involvement in human rights violations. They would say that they've been doing everything they can to respect and protect human rights. They acknowledge the human rights framework in the business and human rights area. So it was very frustrating in a sense, because we said, okay, we are doing this dialogue, it's very important, but sometimes it can be very frustrating for victims and affected communities if they this is the response they get. But sometimes these responses were the only responses they got. It was the only chance of actually being heard by a company. So so this was the powerful part. But the dilemmas were being from the South and having this chance of talking to these big companies. Did we really improve the lives of these communities? Were we just giving space to companies to speak, and knowing that these relationships are very asymmetrical, right? So we did provide the space for both, equal spaces, but many times we were accused by NGOs of being too close to the companies. And then we were accused by the companies of being too close to the communities. So that was sometimes very, very difficult and very frustrating. And sometimes we heard, but also we heard many good things, like in the sense that sometimes this information was very useful for victims to use in their legal cases brought in court, because otherwise they wouldn't have information. Information is not available, companies do not respond. So sometimes this was very powerful for them. And sometimes this also helped them raise international awareness. And then it caught the attention of investors, for instance. It caught the attention of governments or the UN. So there was this other side, but there was always a lot of criticism so we were in between that. So that's, but I still think it's good. I think it's very important to bring information as much as we can and do some dialogue. But I think there is a limit for this dialogue. There is a point where we won't be able to. And one of the avenues in the end that I used to do at the center, and I've been doing also at Conectas, is organizing a few conversations with investors, especially from the extractive sector and related also sometimes to climate, because they are very concerned. They don't want to lose money. And there are some investors that are concerned with social environmental issues. So we saw this as a leverage for pressure, because we know companies will be very concerned with what these investors are thinking about. So one of the cases I've been working a lot on with investors is on the case of the dam disasters of Rio Doce and Brumadinho, trying to engage with investors that are investors of these big mining companies, and asking for their help to pressure these companies to change. They really need to change. This is not a world we want to live in. It's not possible. We know there will be a new disaster very soon. And
Julia,
we also, yeah, no, go ahead.
No,
Paula.
you mentioned the case of Brumadinho and Rio Doce more than once. And I don't know if everybody is familiar with the size of what happened. So these are two dams, and maybe if you have some information, I don't know if you have it at hand, but just to give an idea of how critical these disasters were.
Yes, so the first disaster took place 5 years ago, exactly 5 years ago, on the 5th of November of 2015. And it involved a tailings dam. So if you don't know what a tailings dam is it's what it was used in the mining process. So the dam will collect all that was produced in this mining process. So in 2015, there was it is considered the worst social environmental disaster in the whole world, because it totally destroyed 3 districts that were very close to the dam. And the dam affected a river. It's one of the most important rivers in this region. It's called Rio Doce. So Doce River, sweet river, that's the translation. And this river involves 3 states. So the mud, the contaminated mud, went from Minas Gerais. It's a state in Brazil. Is one of the most is the state where we have most of the mining production in Brazil. So the mud went down the river for over 700 kilometers. So that would be how many? So that's like crossing maybe 1/3 of Canada. I don't know, or 1/4 of Canada, let's say. It is really big. And it reached the ocean, and then months after, it reached also some protected areas in the north of the country. So this is the middle of the country, went down to the river, down to the ocean, and then up Brazil. And then there were reports, so it killed millions of beings, right? Nature, everything was, the river was killed for a while. It is trying to rebirth, but for indigenous groups that live off the river, they say a member of our family is dead, the Watu. And the second disaster happened last year, and it killed the first disaster killed 19 people, fortunately, not more than that. But the second disaster killed nearly 300 people. And then the first disaster, we count more than 1 million people have been affected in different ways. And the second disaster, it killed nearly 300 people. It also destroyed part of the city of Brumadinho and the areas around. These 2 dams were less than 100 kilometers close. They were very close, and it's a region where there are many other dumps, and there are many high-risk dumps like these ones. This is why I'm saying I'm really sure, unfortunately, we are going to have another disaster like this one. And these are the results of predatory mining for sure, and for the lack of safety in dumps, in the buildings, and then the lack of oversight of institutions, but also the international community. We had a transnational company operating in Brazil. So it raises a lot of issues on accountability for companies and for crimes that have, environmental, social environmental crimes committed abroad. And for the second case, there is a lawsuit in Germany suing a German company for the certificate of safety it issued regarding the dump. And for the first case, there are many lawsuits in Brazil, but there is also a lawsuit against the company of BHP in the UK, because the company belonged to Vale and BHP, and they had a joint venture with Samarco. Samarco was the actually company operating in Brazil. So these are quick summaries. But
yeah.
I can send you more information.
Maybe we could explore a bit more
sure.
Exactly that, like the area of international law, because you mentioned that at the beginning that you were also using international law, and I was wondering if you could share with us your view on how adequate and sufficient, let's say, the international human rights law is in regards to business and human rights, or human rights and business. Let's put in the right order.
Thank you, Paula. No, that's exactly a very important topic, because this is one of the main issues: how to bring companies accountable for their crimes, how to define who is responsible. Right, this is a big debate in business human rights or international law, human rights international law. Like, should we keep the main framework in which we say the state is more responsible, should be held accountable for omission, for instance, in these cases? Should we bring the state and the companies accountable? Should we bring the companies accountable? The truth is that I think it's fair to say that nowadays, in these days, it is very hard to either way to bring either the states or the companies accountable for social and environmental crimes, especially abroad. So for a company operating in another country, right, the legal system in the US, for instance, and we had some setbacks in a few cases. But in the case of, these cases have shown to us that it's almost impossible to hold accountable a company for that. Last week, there was a decision by the court in the UK. It is not the final decision, but it's a decision that says that the Brazilian court should be the one responsible for holding BHP accountable for what happened in the case of the Rio Dos disaster. And the UK court does not have the meaning, the ways to look into more than 1,000 pages of a process. They wouldn't understand the case completely. I found this decision very, very complicated. We should study. We should have students studying this decision, because I think it's very weird. It's a very weird decision. How come the judges did not look at the case properly and already said that this is a Brazilian judge that should be taking care? It's been 5 years in the case, for instance, and no reparation, nothing. The houses have not been built. People still have not had their houses. So I think it's very controversial. But Paula, I think there's an opportunity also to say, so we have other examples of how it is difficult to hold these companies accountable. So you cannot bring a lawsuit against well, there we managed because BHP was operating here and there, but now we have this decision. So it shows us that how difficult it is. And it's been very difficult also to find one of the things is to find the nexus causal, so the causal, what connects to the crime and the responsibility of those, to really show that this company was really responsible for that, like was really liable for what happened in their supply chain. One of the things we want to improve, and these are these discussions in Europe, in the US, in Canada, and in South America and other regions, is to have legislations that will consider the role of these companies in the countries, but also abroad. So trying to a bit make these companies responsible for what happened in their supply chains. It is not totally possible yet, but we're getting close. So that France has a legislation, the droit de vigilance, that can be maybe can bring us some hope. Right? Let's see how effective it is. They are trying already. There are a few cases, one against Total, and there is a new case about a company of agro that produces pesticides. So it could be a hope that in this case is only for French companies operating in France and in other countries. So that's already something. And there is already discussions of doing a legislation in Europe for the whole region on due diligence and human rights that would make easier to find these connections that I mentioned, right? So in supply chains, we need to have information really. What was the company doing? What are all the tiers, right? Tiers involved in the supply chain. The criminal system would have to be improved also so that we could bring lawsuits against these companies, right? Usually you can only bring, you cannot really bring about the whole company itself. So we still need to improve a lot, and there are discussions in the UN for a treaty that would make companies accountable for their involvement in human rights violations. So not only the state, but also companies. This treaty is being discussed for a few years now, and there is a lot of hot and heated debates, right? More than appropriate to say heated debates. And I think it's going to take a few years until, and if it is approved. And for us, we've been also using a few extrajudicial mechanisms that can help us. For instance, we have cases against multinationals using OECD complaint system, the NCPs. So we do have a case here in Brazil, for instance, against 6 of the biggest coffee producers in the world. And it can be a possibility, but it's extrajudicial. So that might be a easier way to improve and maybe make the system work better. Mm-hmm. I think I forgot to say one important issue, which is usually one of the things we want to improve in this international legislation is to make sure that the companies, the violators, have the burden of proof and not the victims, not the affected communities. Because this would be making, how can we, in such asymmetrical relationships, how would be possible for victims to really prove, right? To provide technical studies. And so that's one of the downsides yet of this system. It is not so yet.
Okay, I'll go in a completely different direction now, and that will be my last question before opening up to the others. And it's a self-interest one, because I work on freedom of expression and information, and so I deal a lot with companies as well, but in a completely different context, that is the tech companies, and the entrance of the tech companies, not the increased power in so many different levels of the tech companies today, with social media platforms, internet-based systems. I feel that we are entering a new moment for the business and human rights discussion. How do you see this too? Because traditionally, when you talk about human rights and business, we always think about mining, extractivism, dams, especially in our region. That's what we have been seeing and discussing for so many years. But now there's this new relationship, and even the relationship with the companies is different, because I was just like, there's the Internet Governance Forum. It's a UN, the main UN forum to discuss internet issues is going on, and we say that it's a multi-stakeholder forum. The companies are always there, they sit on the table, and it's a different relationship with civil society as well. It's getting more complicated, but it was a very positive one at the beginning. So I was just wondering, like, thinking about accountability, thinking about their role in elections, in democracy. So there's a new wave of new types of violations that are coming with these companies. And have you worked as well with tech companies, and how is it really different, and how has these two worlds being dealt with within the business and human rights movement?
This is an amazing and important question, and I think we should really delve into this next years to come. And like, we have municipal elections this Sunday, so I'm crazy to see what the impact of these companies have been and will be. What will be the role of these companies after we get the results of the elections? So the first part of my answer would be that if we look at the last two elections, presidential elections in Brazil in 2018 and 2014, we can clearly see the impact of tech companies, maybe not directly involved, but the use of the apps that some of these companies provide in the elections. So this happened in Brazil and in many other countries, as you all know. We saw the elections in the US, in India, in many other countries. And it was not different with the Brazilian elections in 2018 that elected Bolsonaro. So last year, so he was elected in 2018, and some of the features used by his campaign were using WhatsApp. WhatsApp is widespread in South America. Like in Brazil is really the main way people communicate these days. So the responsible people for the campaigns of Bolsonaro used WhatsApp messages to spread fake news throughout the whole election process. And despite the fact this was already prohibited by our electoral law, right? And then I just saw that last year in the end, I think it's been a year now, October 2019, WhatsApp actually admitted that let me see if I can find exactly this information. but he did admit that he had been used in the elections. So that's something very serious. And we see the increasing role of companies in elections, shaping really not only elections, but also the state itself, government itself. So, so that we saw the role of WhatsApp in fake news, but in the elections of Bolsonaro, we also saw, well, in the same, it's the same company now, right? Facebook and WhatsApp, but Facebook Facebook did not respond, I think, adequately or properly to violent attacks on women related to the elections. So there was, at the time of the, before the election of Bolsonaro, there was a group that was formed by women across the country, and it was a Facebook group that organized protests, huge protests in the streets of São Paulo and other cities in Brazil. And then some of the organizers of this group were attacked, physically attacked, not only with messages. And I don't think Facebook responded appropriately. The Facebook, the group was also attacked online. So there were hackers that invaded the group. And unfortunately, Facebook did not respond adequately. So these are just two examples, well, big examples, but there are many studies now and groups looking at it. So in Brazil, Paula has, I think, worked also with coding rights, that has written also, I'm not sure, Paula, you explain better, but I know coding rights has been working a lot on internet and big companies, and internationally, this has become a big issue for business and human rights, how tech companies should be held accountable for incitating violence, for influencing democracies, for influencing elections, and how we can make them accountable for that. But again, if for the other areas where it might be easier to find this connection, you can imagine how difficult it is also for these tech companies.
Cause and consequence, you mean? Like to show cause and consequence.
Exactly, the cause and that's right. The link of cause and consequence, that for us in the legal field, it's essential, right, to hold them accountable. So we still lack access to information and to really find them accountable for that. And one last piece of this response should be on apps. So these are a bit of technology companies and also, I would say, transport companies, because Uber, 99 in Latin America, Lyft, right? And other companies that make use of tech companies or are tech companies. They've been changing what we understand as workers, right? The right of workers. And it will, and has been posing also important questions to human rights protection. So how to hold these companies accountable if they don't consider people who are working for them as workers, right? They are not actually, they consider themselves tech companies, not transport companies. So technically people are not working for them. So these are, well, questions of the times we're living. Hard to go back, but we really need to think better how to, protect people from gross human rights violations that are happening in these new scenarios, new ways of operating, new ways of producing, right? So, so my quick answer now, my second part of the answer is yes, Paula, we are looking into that, and we should look even more, because the technology is affecting everything, these tech companies, including privacy.
Thank you, Julia. I'll stop now and over to you, Professor Van Praagh, and I'll give the chance to the others to also pose their questions.
Thank you very much, Paula, and thank you so much, Julia. I'm taking notes, and it's just pages and pages, and there are so many connections to so many things that I know a number of us are interested in, or try to teach our students, or try to give our students some little taste of the challenges while the world is changing so quickly. That what you've been talking about, I think as a teacher, just underscores the ways in which no law teacher today could start in their career and rely on their notes that they took as a student, because I mean they could go back to those for some foundational principles and concepts, but then so much of the teaching and learning is about how some of those principles and concepts, we need to have real innovation and determination and tenacity to be innovative in bringing them to these new challenges. As I listened to you, I thought you so much embody this theme for the workshop series this year about the potential and power of women in law and leading the change, because I mean, just listening, it's hard. I feel breathless imagining how much energy and patience and just positive going day to day is required in terms of what you're doing. So anyway, with that, I mean, I have some questions, but I will leave those and turn to other participants who may have questions, and you can. Well, we're a nice sized group for this. So if you have, and you just want to turn on your mic, maybe you can, if you know how to do this under participants and put up a little hand, then I can call on you. But otherwise, you can just unmute and ask a question. And if no one does that, I will just call on somebody to ask a question, which I'm actually very good at. Or a comment. It can be a comment, right? It could be a comment. It could be in my experience, I've also thought of this, and it seems connected. Would somebody like to? Everybody's very shy. I find this on Zoom. It's actually harder on Zoom to get people to put up a hand. Well, maybe I will just start with a short question, kind of. So I teach. I typically teach, and I'm doing this year, first-year students in the extra contractual obligations course. So a foundational course on the private law of civil wrongs. And so this question kind of takes you right back to Paula's initial question about she asked about the role of human rights in legal education. I guess I would ask about whether your sense is that law students, future jurists, are introduced to some of these ideas in their study of the private law of civil wrongs, in their study of property law, in their study of business law, business associations and corporate responsibility, and whether there are interesting opportunities for intersections or interactions among scholars and teachers who might traditionally have thought of themselves in different little clusters, right? Like the private law professors, and then there are the human rights professors, and then there are public law professors. But I think what your projects show, and of course they are the projects of many similar individuals and organizations around the world, they really show this dynamic interaction among kind of traditional categories of learning law and thinking about law. And as I listened to you talking about, moving the burden of proof, establishing a causal connection, thinking about the possibility of holding an enterprise responsible without having to show fault, but just because what they're doing in terms of of whether, whether they're Facebook or they're a mining company or they're a petroleum company, that carries risks and that they should pick up the bill, even if they're not figuratively put in jail. So that was my kind of observation and question. So yeah.
Thank you, Professor Shauna. Yes, definitely. I think first to say that despite the fact that that human rights is not still mandatory for everyone, there have been some very interesting initiatives in many universities exactly bringing this perspective that you mentioned. So there are a few professors, for instance, at the University of São Paulo, that they started like a working group to study how private law has an impact to human rights. And then sometimes they do like even study cases, or they try to really bring the human rights language to that, to kind of work across this to parallel levels, right? Because we, from the human rights field, we kind of have another framework and another way of another language for ourselves. We call the human rights grammar, usually the human rights grammar, right? So there are professors at the Law School of the University of São Paulo doing that, crossing these boundaries, and trying to bring to their classes that are on commercial law some of these cases. And there is our group, the group I helped found at the FGV Law School. It's a private school, not a, we created this, it was a group, and now it's a center on business and human rights. And before, when we founded the group, before we founded, we held many roundtables with professors for commercial law, business law, private sector, that are private sector and private law, that would bring this perspective, especially to bring their, a more creative way of thinking. Like, because usually in human rights law, we usually use constitutional law, right? So in Brazil, at least in Latin America, we use a lot of constitutional law, and then we go to the UN system. But we, in order to really hold these companies accountable, we had to leave a bit this safe way of thinking and start thinking out of the box. And there were teachers open to that. And FGV has a lot of, it's very open for that, especially because there are not so many students in class. So there are many professors who, not many, but there are a few professors who have been open to this dialogue and open to think how the tools that they usually use in their areas could be used for human rights protection. So we've been trying to think, for instance, how to use, how do we call it in English? I forgot now. CVM, sabe, Paulinha? CVM is like it is the chamber. I'll come back to that later so that I can translate. But it's really how to use private law in a more really creative way, I would say. I would think
shareholders.
It could be. So one of the ways is shareholders. So some people did this with professors, like buying assets in a company so they can vote in the shareholders meeting, for instance, or bring lawsuits against shareholders. We can see that happening, not widespread, but we can see that happening. People going beyond their safe boundaries. So let's think out of the box. And I think that's amazing as a learning opportunity, right? Let's use everything we have in the legal framework to protect human rights. One of the things that was kind of interesting in Brazil is we had a very progressive law in the 90s on consumers' rights. And usually in the business human rights field, we don't talk too much about consumers' rights, but this specific law in Brazilian law was a way of actually bringing companies accountable for some kind of violations, and already use the burden of proof. For instance, it's on the companies, not on the victims, right? So it was, and then for instance, I had classes of consumer rights when I was in law school. I think it was not mandatory already, but most of people who were teaching these classes were professors that were more focused on commercial law and other. They had this more traditional framing, so that was quite interesting.
Yeah. So that's great, and really a helpful and thoughtful answer, and also reassuring and inspiring as well in terms of some of these examples. So I'm going to turn to my colleague Jane Glenn, who I think embodies the theme of this workshop series, the potential and power of women in law and leading the change. I mentioned to you already, Julia, that Professor Glenn was the first woman to be a full-time faculty member at McGill in the Faculty of Law. So yes, very inspiring and a wonderful role model for many of us. So Jane has taught property law and has done research in law and development for many, many years. So Jane, I think you have a question or comment.
Well, now I'm all nervous. I won't be able to think of what I was saying, but I was thinking about when I did my own graduate work, which was in France. And in France, you either did public law or you did private law. And so since Pat did private law, I, by definition, did public law. And it turned out to be quite interesting as a topic. And then we had a very good professor in human rights in the public law section, but we mainly talked about civil and political rights in the UN conventions and so on and so forth. And we didn't talk very much about social and economic rights. So I think that sort of that's what I've been hearing Julia saying. I mean, I've been saying to myself, yes, yes, as she speaks. And I think that's it. I can hardly read my little handwriting, but I mean, I'm just saying that I agree with you.
Wow, this is an honor, Professor Glenn. First, it's very inspiring, to have a woman in this role that you played, Glenn. I think for all of us, and it's not surprising we only have women here, right? I think this comment is very important because usually when we talk about human rights protection, that's, I think, even a continuation of what we were talking before with Professor Shauna. It was really divided in public and private law. You were totally right, Professor Glenn. And when we thought about human rights protection, we usually used public law, right? Constitutional law. In Brazil, we call it administrative law, which I think in France is also very used. But then, and it was, I think at the time, it was probably enough for the kind of violations we had in the world. So there was, countries liberating from colonization in Africa. We had dictatorships in Latin America. But for us from the global South, alongside this history of political threats and civil rights threats, we always had to struggle with poverty right, as part of famine, hunger, right to health. So there was not a health system available for everyone, education. So these were still primary, right? So at the same time, we were fighting for the right to be a free country, or a country to be independent from the colonizers. In Africa, for instance, in our region, we were fighting to be democracies. Along, we had all these other pressing rights also. And I think that we realized, the instruments were not enough. We had to think how to really cross these boundaries. But I think another issue is the role companies had. So if we look until then, we mostly, the UN system is based really on states, right? So on the role of states. So the human rights grammar is that we bring, we do reports, and then we bring these reports to the UN to show how states were unable to fulfill their commitments regarding human rights. Mm-hmm. But then with the increasing power of companies now, we know there are companies today that are more powerful sometimes than states. They are richer and more, and have their impacts sometimes more than in states. We had to start thinking, there is another actor here. We should be thinking of how this actor should be held accountable also. Holding only states accountable for that maybe was not enough, right? In the 70s and in the from the 70s to the 90s, I think there were several attempts within the UN to study how to bring companies accountable, because their role was increasing. But we reached a level with the globalization in which it was unbearable. We had to think of these actors as powerful, or sometimes more powerful than states. And then that's where I see the connection between public and private sector even more important, because if we can use this, we can use constitutional rights, we can use, but administrative rights, but and other rights within the public law sphere. But we saw that maybe this was not enough, because it was mostly related to the role of the state, right? So I think we had we have still to be creative in using private law also to hold even, the companies accountable for that, for human rights violations. So these are, this is the beauty of the word. It's changing, bringing new questions, new dilemmas, and some old ones that are still not resolved. Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I wonder if I don't see another hand up. I have a very small question, which is, I'm sure you know and have been watching with interest developments in India and New Zealand in particular, about actually thinking of when you were describing the river, the Rio Doce. I thought, are there any advocates who are supporting Indigenous communities in thinking about kind of official personality rights or for a river, for example? Because it's interesting to see all of these different creative attempts in different places to try to increase this. Well, it goes back to the name of your organization, this connectivity, right? The connections among all of us. So I wondered about that, and also, but I'm seeing one other question, so maybe I'll take that question too, and then allow you to respond to both as we come to the end of the workshop. So a question from Maria Ceballos from Colombia, one of our doctoral students.
Thank you.
There it is. Thank you, Julia and Paula, for this very stimulating conversation. This was totally like mind-blowing. So Julia, you mentioned that one of your interests has been the sort of the intersection of racial and gender discrimination. And I would like to know like how developed this discussion is in Brazil, particularly within or in the legal profession. And I'm asking this because in Colombia, we're just beginning to talk about gender and racial inequalities, but there's an almost total absence of reflections on intersectionality, particularly in the legal academia, but even in the world of NGOs. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the, I don't know, the state of the discussion in Brazil, but more importantly, I would like to know what has been your approach to it and what has been like the role of the, or the importance of the intersectional perspective in your work as an academic and as an advocate.
Thank you.
So wonderful.
Oh,
So
sorry.
that's okay. So Julia, why don't you start by responding to
Sure.
Maria, and we'll see. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you, Maria. Yeah, for very good question. And for me, it's really important. So I can say that I had an amazing opportunity in my life to be a student of Professor Kimberly Crenshaw when I was at Columbia Law School. And I worked with her she was my professor, and we became close, and we also worked together, and she was fundamental. And maybe one of the, and that's very sad to say, one of the very few Black women who were my professors. I had only one Black professor in law school, and in high school I had some, but you won't see many legal professors who are Black women. And then so it was very important for my thinking of that. But before I went to Colombia, I worked on a case. I was still an intern at Conectas at that time. I think at the time I already had finished. Had already finished the school, but I worked on the case that was, and with many other people, amazing people. I was still learning everything, on where we brought to the Supreme Court a case of affirmative based actions on higher legal education. And that case was fundamental to years later to have quotas in higher education in Brazil. But only this was in the beginning of the years 2000, and only now 2020 the University of São Paulo is adopting that. So so I was happy to be part of that, and I will get back to that soon. And I also worked on another case while I was in New York with the Center for Reproductive Rights on a very, very sad case, which was a case of maternal mortality of Black women in the case of Rio de Janeiro, who died when she was pregnant of 6 months. And then she died, it was maternal mortality. And one of the issues was regarding access to health. She didn't have proper access to health. She lived in a very poor region, but Brazil was not so poor that could not provide her these basic rights, right? So we brought the case in the UN and at CEDAW, and it was the first maternal mortality case in the world. And so I was very happy to do that. And I had the opportunity to bring, to think about the connection between race and gender discrimination in this case. And when Brazil had to implement this decision, it was one of the recommendations from CEDAW to consider race and gender on the access to health in Brazil. And then this has shaped the policy that came after that. So not to say that everything is good now, but it has brought a lot of, the debates and dialogues and that were generated. So I mean, this petition really helped. This case really helped broaden what the the Black women's movement in Brazil was addressing for many years, but finally in the years 2000, this became a reality in the access to health policy in Brazil. So that's our first answer. And then just to go back to race and gender issues, I usually I try to use this as a framework for everything we do. So when looking at these cases, I mentioned to you, or business human rights as a framework in general, we have to think in several ways. Who is more affected by these human rights violations? Who are the human rights defenders who are fighting strongly in the fields, in the territories where these violations take place? So, and who are leading also the resistance? And so this is one of the frameworks that I try to adopt. And thinking about law schools, I think public and state universities in Brazil are very different from what they were 10 years ago, before having non-white people getting into these universities. And this has been pressing for law schools, including, but all courses, to rethink the way they are teaching, to rethink authors they are using, to rethink a bit who is part of the university. So this was through affirmative action, but also programs to bring poor people to the university also, where the state was paying for them to study. So that's a quick answer. I don't want to bother you too much.
I don't think you're bothering anyone, and I think it's wonderful to hear about the ways in which you see that intersectionality providing an ongoing and kind of organic and supportive framework for all of these different initiatives and projects that you're undertaking. And I think that's a very inspiring way to bring this conversation to a close. So I should just do that formally, and then once I've finished off the formal thank yous, we can stop the recording, Sharon, in a moment, and then whoever wants to stay informally for a couple of moments, that would be fine. So thank you so much, Julia, on behalf of the Faculty of Law and also the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism, and thank you to Paula. Obrigado to both of you. It's really it's just wonderful to see all of these different connections. I think for the people, for the participants in the workshop, that everybody has different interests and different angles that they heard resonating in your comments. But I also thought that if we do, and I hope you will consent to keeping this recording available, because I actually think we often treat first-year law students as if they have to do the foundational, like the foundations before they jump later on to some of these challenges. And I think I will encourage my first-year students to listen, because I think even if they don't understand all of the different pieces, they can definitely feel kind of inspired and think about the paths that they may take and the combinations of courses that may still feel kind of unusual, or not the ones that that they hear that their predecessors have taken, but that there's real potential in mixing and matching these different approaches that we can find in law, and also, as you mentioned at the beginning, reaching beyond the discipline of law and paying attention to the insights from other perspectives, particularly when we think about socioeconomic rights. We obviously have to do that. So with that, thank you so much for this workshop and this as I say, kind of inspirational moment in mid-November in the academic year. It's very lovely, and I think the conversation between you and Paula was also wonderful to listen to in terms of the dynamics and the different perspectives that brought. So thanks.